So I think we're ready for our next talk, and that's Pat Brandis with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
It's working yet? Is it working? Is it working? Good? Yes? Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. Thanks for the introduction, Sam, and thank you for inviting me for being here today. So let me get my presentation started. All right, let's see. So mine's unique. All right.
Don't push the green button when you're pointing at the audience.
Sorry. It's coming up. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I'd also like to recognize my collaborators on this presentation, Ken Newman, who's a mathematical statistician with our office, with the service, and Rebecca Buchanan, who's with the University of Washington, and Josh Israel with the Bureau of Reclamation. All right, do I got to go backwards? Somebody else want to push the buttons for me? Or?
I can push, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so this is my outline of the talk here. I'm going to try to summarize some of the results of the last studies for the last 30 years in 20 or 30 minutes. That's pretty hard to do. A lot of this, I'm going to start with a background, a conceptual model, which I started with something that was from the South Delta Collaborative Studies group that Lee had, and I modified it quite a bit, so it's just mine personal conceptual model. And then I'll talk about some of the results of the VAMP studies, which used the Kodawar tagfish. And with the VAMP, I just want to reemphasize that the VAMP included a physical head of old river barrier. And so those were part of the design criteria for that study. Also, with my background, I'm going to show some historical estimates of what delta survival has been for fish released in the South Delta. I'm going to show some results of modeling by Ken Newman, who included the VAMP data and some pre-VAMP data. And then I'll show some results of the 2008 through 2011, which was acoustic tagging results as part of the VAMP. And then results of 2012 Chinook studies and 2011 and 12 steelhead studies, and that's all relatively new. Most of the data and stuff has been written up and is available with the exception of the 2012 information. And then finish off at the end with some lessons learned. Okay, so I'm going to start with my conceptual model here. It's just very complicated. I just focused on the things in bold, kind of, starting with delta exports and reduced inflows and how that affects and the head of Old River Barrier and how that affects distribution of the water and how it affects smolt movement as the fish move downstream, and where they enter, which route they enter, how long they're in those routes, and how temperature is involved as well, and predation, and ultimately you either have mortality at the end or survival to Chips Island. And then just go back. And not that you need to know any of that, just understand it's complicated, and I think we've all come to that conclusion that what goes on is very complicated. Next slide. Again, I just want to reemphasize that the head of Old River Barrier was part of the VAMP study. Okay, next. Okay, so this graph, I think, shows part of what VAMP was asked to do. VAMP was asked to identify whether or not an increase of flows with the head of Old River Barrier in place would increase smolt survival through the delta. And so we were measuring survival from Mossdale or Durham Ferry to Jersey Point. And I think all this data was gathered with the barrier in place, shows as flows increase at Vernalis, you generally saw an increase in survival. And this is in the range, as Bruce talked about, that's the manageable range, from 0 to a little over 6,000 CFS. That's where you could put the barrier in place. Anything above that, the barrier couldn't be installed. Next slide, please. But as Bruce mentioned, part of the VAMP was to explore the role of exports as well. And two of the conditions that were in the matrix was to to have exports of 3,000, exports of 1,500 at a flow level at 7,000. Those conditions were never achieved during the 12-year period. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to just show what survival has been since we were measuring it from Durham Ferry or Mossdale to Jersey Point. And this includes years with the barrier, and it's noted at the top there, or years without the barrier in place. And in general, you can see a general decline over time of survival through the delta. With higher flow years in 2005, 2006, a little bit of an uptick, but not what we would have expected based on what we'd gotten in between 95 and 99, where there were higher flows in the delta. Next slide, please. Okay, so the VAMP was part of a peer review panel in 2010, where they looked at all the results from VAMP, and they noted that it looked like that survival appeared to be decreasing at any one level of flows. The top was the highest flows, medium flows, low flows, or very low flows. In recent years, it looked like you just got less survival for those categories of flow. Next slide, please. Okay, so Ken Newman, our mathematical statistician, did some modeling of all of the data we had in the South Delta. He used 35 release recovery sets from 1985 to 2006. This is generally the kind of the schematic of how he was looking at the modeling. Fish were released at Durham Ferry and at Mossdale, and then they're splitting into Old River or staying in the main stem San Joaquin River, and then they're recovered at Jersey Point, Antioch, Chips Island, and in the ocean fishery. And he uses this Bayesian hierarchical models to incorporate the various levels of uncertainty. Next slide, please. So this is some of the results. He focused on two models, one for survival down the main stem San Joaquin River between Dos Rios and Jersey Point, and then the other focusing on the pathway from Old River to Jersey Point. And these are the four different models and the model probabilities for those four routes. Constants were the best, flow was the next level, export, and then both. None of them were real compelling. The next slide, please. And then this is the coefficients of the parameters with the average, by averaging those four models, which essentially said the strongest effect, although relatively weak, was with increases in San Joaquin flow would increase survival in the San Joaquin route. And that one of the findings was that usually you had higher survival if the fish stayed in the San Joaquin River rather than going down Old River, but there was a lot of environmental noise and variation. Next slide, please. Okay, so in 2007, we actually transitioned to acoustic tags, away from the Kodawar tags to acoustic tags. A couple of reasons for doing that, I think Bruce had mentioned them previously, was in 2007, we were getting several 100,000 Kodawar tag fish from Department of Fish and Game at the time. And in 2007, they had so few returns in the fall of 2006 that they couldn't provide us with the juvenile fish that we needed in 2007 to run a typical Kodawar tag experiment. So that was one reason we moved to acoustic tags. We needed less fish to get estimates. And then the second aspect was that there had been concerns about the incidental take of delta smelt at the downstream recovery locations at Antioch and at Chips Island. And so we were concerned that if we did continue with the Kodawar tag studies, that our sampling would be interrupted by some of the incidental take concerns, and that we would be shut down with our sampling and would not be able to get recoveries at those locations. So we transitioned to acoustic tags, but they are not without their challenges. One of the limiting factors we had right away was that the acoustic tags, the smallest acoustic tags we could get at the time, were 0.65 grams. And to meet the recommended tag weight to body weight ratio of 5%, we needed to get fish that were 105 millimeters, which were relatively large compared to what was available. So in some ways, we had to delay in certain years by a couple of weeks to release fish to meet those to get that size of fish available. With the Kodawar tag fish, we would have released them somewhat earlier and at a somewhat smaller size. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so with the acoustic tagging, we have a whole receiver array. This is the receiver array that was used in 2011. And you'll notice that there's a receiver at Chips Island and Jersey Point. Lee, can I take the pointer back here? Okay, so here's Chips Island here. Here's Jersey Point right there. So in 2011, we had receivers at both of those downstream locations. And as you recall, the Kodawar tagfish studies were measuring survival from Mossdale or Durham Ferry, here's a release site, Mossdale, to Jersey Point. These acoustic tagging studies now allowed us to measure survival all the way to Chips Island. So in 2006, 2007, the acoustic tagging was a pilot effort. In 2008, we had receivers at Jersey Point and at Chips Island, which were the downstream receivers that were allowing us to estimate survival through the delta. But we had premature tag failure with the tags that we were using, which created potential bias. In 2009, we were unable to have receivers again at Jersey Point or Chips Island. And in 2010, we only had them at Chips Island. So in 2011, we finally had all the receivers in place and tags that were working. And that was the last year of VAMP. So the annual funding that provided, this structure and framework after VAMP ended in 2011 stopped. The good news is that in the National Marine Fisheries Service's BIOP to the Bureau of Reclamation, there was a 6-year steelhead study that was requested, and so that started in 2011. So in 2012, that study was in place and had an acoustic array supported from that study. And so in 2012, we were able to release Chinook salmon as well, transitioning to a VEMCO system from an HTI system, which is a different vendor. So there was also the downstream receivers in 2012 and 13 were at Jersey Point and Chips Island, and then also in this year as well. And one thing that we're challenged with this year is that we usually use Merced River fish, which is on the Merced River in the San Joaquin Basin for these studies. And in this year, we've had some disease problems at Merced, and they're not available, so we're making use of fish from the Macaulay River hatchery. All right, Lee, back to you. Okay, so one of the other challenges with acoustic tag fish is that if your tagged salmon or steelhead is eaten by a predator, and it's a striped bass, and he or she moves by the receivers, then you are assuming it's still an alive smolt. You're getting a detection from that fish. Even though it is no longer an alive fish, it's now inside of a predator. So that created some uncertainty in our estimates. So we developed a predator filter that we used starting in 2009, and we based it on different behavioral patterns of the detections that we saw, some of it based on travel time or residence time, whether fish are moving upstream. We don't expect salmon to be moving upstream against the current, so we think, okay, well, that looks like a predator. So we had a whole series of these kinds of rules that we used to try to distinguish the detections that we obtained, which were still in salmon smolts versus ones that were in predators. And so the way we handled that then is we actually did the analysis two different ways. We did the analysis with all the detections, and then we did the analysis again with just the detections from what we thought was still in salmon smolts. Okay, next slide, please. So this is a slide of, well, what difference does it make to the estimates of survival that we had? In 2010, it made the biggest difference. This is for survival to Chips Island in 2010, and you can see with the predator detections removed, we got an average of survival of 5%, and when you included all the detections, you almost got double that with 0.11, with 11% survival through the delta. Next slide. So now I'm going to go through a series of slides comparing the acoustic tagging results over the various years. This slide is to show the proportion of fish diverted into Old River. That's been identified. They're up there on my right is the junction there at the head of Old River, and as mentioned earlier, Old River goes to the west. So with the acoustic tags now, with and the acoustic array in place, we're able to determine what percentage of the smolts released at Durham Ferry, migrating down to Mossdale, and then splitting at that head of Old River, what proportion are staying on the main stem San Joaquin River, and what portion are going into Old River. And this just shows, for instance, in 2008, we think 66% of the fish that hit that junction actually went into Old River. And then in contrast, in 2012, there was a physical head of Old River barrier there, and only 2% went into Old River. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is just an example of another thing that acoustic tags provide us now. We can take these routes and divide them into smaller reaches or regions. And this is what we call the South Delta region, which is from Mossdale, and it's on the Old River to the facilities and to Old River at Highway 4, or on the San Joaquin River down to the Turner Cut Junction. So that region, we were able to estimate survival in that region from 2009 to 2012. And here it looks like there's a relationship potentially to flow. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the real question is, well, what's survival been from Mossdale to Chips Island with these acoustic tags? Well, it's been pretty low since we've been measuring them in 2008 through 2012. Very low survival through the whole delta. But the real, I guess the question is then, well, why is that? And so, next slide. Oh, before I go to that, so to standardize the survival in the various reaches, then we looked at survival per kilometer. And here's what the survival per kilometer was from Mossdale to Chips Island in the various years for either fall run Chinook or for steelhead. And I just identified kind of where down below the table is survival per kilometer. And if you have that survival per kilometer, what total survival to chips would be. Lee, can I use the pointer for a minute? Okay, so survival per kilometer, if it's 0.83 survival per kilometer, you're going to get nothing at Chips Island, to zero survival. So this is just showing you what kind of survival per kilometer do you need to get reasonable estimates of survival to Chips Island. So you need to have a survival estimate per kilometer 0.997 to get 75%, 76% survival, 0.99 to get a 40% survival through the delta. And then it just shows you here, where are we lining up, okay? So steelhead in 2011 did the best, steelhead in 2012 the second best, and then 2011 and 12 for the Chinook, and 2010. So very relatively low for the Chinook. Okay, so again, the acoustic tags allow us to divide up the broader reach into routes. These particular routes, there's two main routes that we use. One's on the San Joaquin all the way to Chips Island, and the other one is Old River. So this gives you the estimates of survival for the San Joaquin route from 2008 to 2012. Didn't have receivers again at Jersey Point or Chips Island in 2009, as you recall, so it's not able to get survival down that route in that particular year. One thing I want to mention, though, that even though at the head of Old River, these fish are on the San Joaquin route, they don't necessarily stay on that route, that there's multiple locations downstream of the head of Old River where fish can move from the main stem San Joaquin River into the interior delta. Next slide. Okay, so breaking that that route down into smaller reaches then to try to identify where some of the mortality is occurring, broken down into different 1 through 10 reaches here, given the kilometer distance of each of the reaches, and show, well, across the board, looking at all these different, the fall wren or the steelhead, where does it look like most of the mortality is occurring? And actually, it looks like it's occurring down here at these reaches down at 6, 7, 8, 9 reaches where there's flow coming from the north, potentially to the south, for the export facilities, and also a very tidally affected region. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the other route, Old River. Fish can try to go through Old River back to the San Joaquin River. That doesn't happen very often. Most likely, fish are going into the salvage facility and being trucked back to the facility. Again, survival through those routes, not very high either. Next slide, please. Okay, same concept here where I've done survival per kilometer and showed where the high mortality reaches are, and it looks like fish are getting to the facilities, but there's mortality getting them back to Chips Island. They're actually released upstream at Chips Island, but our measurement would include being trucked back to the delta and then survival from back to the release point back to Chips Island, because there's 4 locations of where the fish are re-released into the delta from the salvage facility, from the salvage trucking, some on the San Joaquin, some on the Sacramento, and then the fish are released there, and then they migrate on their own to Chips Island. So it's the combination of that survival that it looks like is poor in some years, especially for the Chinook. Next slide. Okay, so just a comparison now. These were the Codoar tag estimates that we had from Mossdale or Durham Ferry to Jersey Point from 94 to 2006. And I've added on now the acoustic tag estimates from 2008 to 2012 and how they compare. And you see they're all 0.1 or below. So survival is generally low still. And then we had to do some estimates in 2010 when there was no receiver at Jersey Point to estimate what survival was to Jersey Point in that particular year. And in 2012, we had a physical barrier in place. And then in 2010, there was a non-physical barrier, which allowed the flows to go into Old River and tried to keep the salmon in the San Joaquin route. Next slide. Okay, so I just want to show then this. I showed this graph earlier. This is all of the VAMP data in the blue, and I've added the acoustic estimates from 2012. We had a physical head of Old River barrier in 2012, and they seem to line up with what we had seen from the Codoar tag fish relative to certain flows with the head of Old River barrier, that potentially flows are increasing survival with that head of Old River barrier in place. Next slide, please. Okay, so what did we learn from the VAMP? So it looks like survival's increased with increased flows with the head of Old River barrier in place. Second thing, you can't always get the conditions you want to test. We weren't able to test the 7,000 CFS flow with the 1,500 and 3,000 exports. I think we see there's a lot of variability and noise in the system, and that the replication is important. And one thing about the VAMP that I've learned to appreciate even more in the last couple of years, it was good to have a structured long-term design so that replication was incorporated into that, and instead of just getting different conditions every year, and so it's hard to get replication under those kinds of situations. And that also the VAMP assured some annual funding. That was a real benefit. Whereas now, for the Chinook study, we're trying to find funding annually every year, and sometimes difficult. And then also, I guess the project operators and the tributary operators work together to try to minimize the fluctuations in flows and exports, which made the interpretation of the data a little bit easier. And then with the Cutawar tag fish, it was really hard to know why fish are surviving, why they're surviving, because all you had was you're putting them in one place and you're recovering them at the end of the line at Chips Island, whereas didn't understand or couldn't identify what was happening with them in between. Whereas the acoustic tag now, we have a little bit more information about breaking down that broader regional thing into more route and reach specific survival. Next slide, please. So what have we learned since VAMP? Okay, acoustic tags allow survival to be measured with greater precision and smaller reaches, but we still have some problems using them and assessing predation, and where there's some level of uncertainty relative to that. And then, again, I mentioned the tag size earlier, that's limiting. We can't tag as small a fish as we'd like to, so we can get them out earlier in the season. And I think I've demonstrated there's mortality hotspots in both the San Joaquin River as well as in Old River. It's not as clear as it used to be as which route is better, whether to be on the Old River or on the San Joaquin River. In most recent years, there hasn't been a significant difference between the two routes, but both of them are pretty poor. But with the last graph I showed, the relationship between the flow and survival with the head of Old River barrier still seems to hold. And I guess just as far as managing expectations, it takes a long time to understand these factors that are influencing survival, and it takes a long-term commitment to answer some of these questions, because the responses seem to be changing and the environment may also be changing, and then this environmental noise is huge, and studies are expensive, and there's no long-term funding that's been identified. Next slide. So just some next steps. We did make releases in 2013, which was a low flow year and no head of Old River barrier. We had both salmon and steelhead that we released. We also have a multi-year analysis plan for the Chinook salmons from 2010 to 2013 that's being funded by the IEP. But we ultimately like to do some multi-year analysis by combining the acoustic tag and the Cutawar tag studies. And then right now we're conducting studies in 2014, which is also a very low flow year, but there is a physical barrier going to be in place. There's multiple estimates for salmon and steelhead. As I mentioned earlier, we're using salmon from the McCallum River hatchery instead of Merced River hatchery this year. We've added receivers at Benicia as a backup to Chips Island to help increase our detection probability at Chips Island. And then in 2015, 2016, as I said, the steelhead study is a 6-year study, and it goes through 2016. So that will be in place. There's no funding for salmon studies after 2014, and it would be cost effective to do salmon survival studies through 2016 since the acoustic array is all in place. And then just to continue to estimate survival, build models, test hypotheses, and refine criteria for assessing predation on tag fish is our ultimate continuation. And I think that's all I had. Thank you.
Well, we're running into our lunch hour a little bit. Pat, you're going to be around later today also. You guys ready to get lunch? So let's take our lunch break, and I'll tell everybody to try to be back at 1 o'clock, even though we'll probably go a little bit later than that, but let's try to get back at 1.